Greetings, dear listeners, I believe is the traditional opening of this podcast. As I used to sometimes say at National Review events, I am not Jonah Goldberg. I am Kevin Williamson. I'm the guy you get when Jonah Goldberg is not available. So you'll just have to make do. So it is the rolling podcast coup d'etat. Once again, I have made an attempt to take over. We'll see how long it lasts this time. I have no idea where Goldberg is or what he's up to. If he's driving around the country in his family truckster. What was the truck called in Stripes? The famous the Winnebago that they end up having to drive through East Germany or something. I'm asking Mitch Kokai here of the John Locke Foundation, who's our guest today, and he is looking at me with a perplexed look on his face, which perhaps means he doesn't remember, or perhaps means he doesn't want to admit how many times he watched that movie when he was 13 years old.
Who's your buddy? Who's your pal?
Yeah,
I remember that piece of it.
Yeah, fun movie, and one that Jonah very much likes, I believe. Anyway, always a pleasure to be here hosting for Jonah. I hope he's having fun, whatever he's doing, and we'll see him when he gets back. We have here, as I said, Mitch Kokai, who is with the John Locke Foundation and a sometime contributor to the Dispatch, who recently wrote on Hurricane Helene and the storm's potential impacts. Did I just use impact? I don't like that word. I mean, I didn't use it as a verb exactly, but still the way I used it, I'm not comfortable with. Its potential effects on politics in North Carolina, and particularly the upcoming presidential election. So welcome to the Remnant. And do you want to summarize your piece for us?
Sure. I mean, the idea was when this piece initially came out, obviously, North Carolina is a battleground state. This is among the states that Donald Trump won, the one that he won with the smallest margin, fewer than 75,000 votes. So any change in the electoral landscape could potentially have an impact on how North Carolina turns out. And without North Carolina, it's unlikely that Donald Trump would be able to win again and return to the White House. So the idea was, okay, well, we know that this storm, Helene, came through western North Carolina and had a major impact on that part of the state, as you saw firsthand, just throwing everything out of whack and throwing people's lives, if they were lucky enough to survive it, because many people did not. But if they did survive the storm, it threw everything of their lives off of track. And so would this have the potential to affect the upcoming election? One of the reasons why you think that it might is among the counties that were affected most heavily by Helene, most of them are so-called red counties. In 2020, of the 25 counties that were in the disaster declaration area, 23 of them went to Donald Trump. This wasn't like 16-9 or something. It was 23-2. Now, the most populous county, Buncombe County, the one where Asheville is located, the only city of any size in western North Carolina, that one is a very Democratic-leaning county and went substantially to Joe Biden. And then another county that's in a college town, Watauga County with Boone, Appalachian State. That one is also more blue than red. But every other county, some of them very heavily so, went to Republicans. And if you added up all of the votes of those 25 counties, plus 3 more that are on the western edge of the state that didn't have the entire county in the disaster declaration area, but did have some Cherokee tribal lands counted. If you threw all of those together, put the number of Donald Trump votes versus the number of Joe Biden votes against each other, and Trump was ahead by some 240,000 votes. Now, his winning margin in North Carolina was less than 75,000. So western North Carolina is really a key to Donald Trump if he wants to win re-election. So the piece focused on that, and also just on what's being done already to try to ensure that North Carolinians in that part of the state will be able to take part, as everyone else does, in the election. And so what we learned is that not too long after the storm came through, there were still 10 or so county elections offices that were closed. By now, they're all open again, so that's a positive sign. But even the ones that were open, we're trying to figure out, okay, are all of the early voting sites still usable? Are all the election day voting sites still usable? What happens if people requested a mail-in ballot and that mail-in ballot may have washed away in the floodwater? So there's still a lot of
Stop
questions.
you there for just 1 second,
Yeah,
because I mean, the answer has to be no, right? That a lot of these polling sites are not usable. There are big swaths of Asheville that are just sort of more or less gone, and whatever polling sites were there are not going to be usable. And of course, you've still got no electricity, no internet connection in some places, no running water. So in what sense would very many of these sites be usable, other than the fact that they are square feet of ground upon which someone could stand and put a box?
that's right. So that is what these local county elections boards are dealing with now. And elections are held in different ways across the country, but in North Carolina, really the boots on the ground work is done at the county level. County boards of elections, with their election staff, the people who have to do the real work, are constantly working on trying to make sure that they have a proper number of polling sites, number of people to staff all of those sites. And that's something that's being done now. That now that these elections board offices are open again, all of these folks are trying to figure out, well, which of our polling sites are still open, and how do we get the word out that people who are going to go to a polling site can go to one of these sites but not the other. And if you had a mail-in ballot, making sure that people know that it's not just the case that if you ask for a mail-in ballot, it was mailed to you, that ballot got lost, that now you can't vote. Yes, you still can vote. If you may have time to request another mail-in ballot if it will actually get to an address and you have time to turn it back in, or you could take part in the early voting that starts on the 17th of October, or to show up on election day itself. So all of those things are being worked out now. Just within the past couple of days, the State Board of Elections held an emergency meeting, and at that meeting, they decided that more than a dozen of the county elections boards would have some sort of special dispensation to try to come up with these arrangements because of all of the destruction that Helene wrought.
Yeah. As you mentioned, I was in Asheville last week. My impression, of course, is that during times like this, the benefits to densely populated urban living become really obvious, and that it's much easier to connect people with food aid, potable water, various kinds of assistance in a place like Asheville, where people can walk to places that are, sort of densely populated downtown, that area, where there are churches and businesses, and where you've got rural central kitchens set up and all of those things. Whereas people who live in the outlying areas are, they're going to be pulling dead people out of houses for a long time, I think, out there, because you've got people trapped in their houses who are elderly or not able to get around, or they're penned in by fallen trees, as people have been in some places. And there's 8/10 of a mile between houses in a lot of these places, or a mile and a half between houses in some of these very remote areas. I think as a lot of people saw this Facebook post that I thought was pretty nifty. People using pack mules down in Black Mountain to deliver insulin and similar supplies to people up in these kind of remote, hard to reach areas. So what I saw anyway was that people in Asheville were getting reasonable access to various kinds of supplies. There were trucks coming in from both, public and private sources. You had, churches, businesses, all sorts of people kind of cooperating to make that happen. That's not really going to be the case up on top of some of these mountains and some of these remote areas. Now, that also suggests to me that it's going to be a lot easier to organize voting in Asheville than it is in the rest of these places. And I hate to be a Machiavellian, cynical political calculator, but it seems to me that if I were the Harris campaign, that's how I'd want it, because the people in Asheville are going to be overwhelmingly Harris voters. The people out in these remote areas, particularly the older ones in rural places, are going to be overwhelmingly Trump voters. Are we going to see a kind of built-in disadvantage that just comes from the facts of geography and the ways that geography imposes itself on patterns of life?
That's a distinct possibility, and I think you're already talking about some of the factors that are leading to the next round of shock conspiracy theories that have been coming out, and that is that because this is Trump country, as you might describe it, that officials at the federal level, run by a Democratic administration or from the state government level run by a Democratic administration have been slow walking efforts to speed the recovery in Western North Carolina. I don't know that there has been any credible evidence that anything is being done to slow walk the effort, but certainly a lot of people who are already inclined to think that maybe the government has it out for them would be inclined to say, oh, and that's also taking place here in the recovery efforts as well. One of the things from the piece that you mentioned earlier that I found very interesting was in it was an email conversation, but a conversation with Chris Cooper, who's a political scientist at Western Carolina University out there in the Silva-Cullowhee area in Jackson County. He was actually having a fairly easy time getting around in his community. He lives in downtown Silva, which is one of the towns in there. And his suggestion was this phenomenon is really going to be location dependent. We think of Helene as having a swath all the way through Western North Carolina. Well, it struck certain areas especially hard. Some areas were not quite as hard hit. And in those areas, people are probably going to be able to get to their polling places, get to the communications efforts and find the information about where to go. And so it really will depend on the areas that were hardest hit. The other factor that you have to weigh in here is that you were talking about Asheville, and yes, it has the advantages of having the densely populated people, you have the infrastructure there. But some of these folks who live what most of us would consider to be off the grid, they have planned their entire lives around this. So if something bad
There's some people out
happens,
there who've been dreaming of this day, right?
it may have been a nightmare, but they thought, okay, something like this could happen, so they have prepared. Now, no one prepared for Helene, but a lot of those people are hardy outdoors folks who they know they're far away from everyone else and from grocery stores, and so they
but there
have
aren't very many of those
preparations.
people,
And
really,
if
are there?
they didn't get particularly hard hit by the storm, they might be okay to get out there. So it really will be location dependent.
There aren't really very many of those people, are there, though? I mean, in absolute numbers, the people who are kind of, I've got 2 weeks worth of potable water and 6 weeks worth of freeze-dried apocalypse lasagna that I bought from a guy who advertised on the Glenn Beck show, and 100,000 rounds of ammunition. I mean, those are my people. Don't get me wrong, in a lot of ways, but
Not a ton of them, but Western North Carolina is where you'd find probably a higher share than normal of those folks.
fair share of them, yeah, I would imagine. Speaking of just the term Western North Carolina, let's talk a little bit about the politics of the state as such, because the western part of the state, of course, is really quite distinct from the eastern part of the state. You've got a state that's got a Democratic governor that has gone. When was the last time I went for a Democrat in a presidential election? I'm trying to remember.
2008, the
The
first
2008.
Obama
That's
election,
right, of
and
course.
that was the first time since 1976. So it's
Okay,
gone mainly Republican over the past 40 plus years, except for the first Obama election.
right. An overwhelmingly Republican state legislature.
Yes, and some will tell you that that's because of gerrymandering. They have veto-proof supermajorities, but if you took the statewide vote totals, which obviously people don't run statewide to be in a legislative district, but the statewide vote totals are more Republican than Democrat, but it's not 60-40. It's more like 52-48, 53-47. But because of the way the districts are drawn and because of the fact that Democrats tend to congregate, and so when they win their district elections, they'll win 65-70% of the vote, whereas the Republicans will win their districts with 52-53% of the vote. Because of the way all of those things factor out, overwhelmingly Republican legislature, even though we're probably not a 50-50 state, probably in the neighborhood of 51-49, 52-48 Republican. That's why in statewide elections, when people don't really know who the candidates are one way or the other, the Republicans tend to have a slight edge, but not a huge edge.
Yeah. Tell me a little about the demographics of partisanship in North Carolina. So, in Texas, where I'm from, it's pretty straightforward in the sense that the rural areas and the small towns are heavily Republican. The big cities are overwhelmingly Democratic. and the suburbs that are culturally more like the cities tend to lean Democratic, although not as strongly as the cities themselves. And then you've got, some kind of no man's land in the middle of kind of small to medium-sized cities like my hometown Lubbock, which is, I guess, now the largest reliably Republican city in Texas, Fort Worth, having been that for a long time, but now no longer being that. So, is the North Carolina split? Is it largely a rural versus urban phenomenon? Is it income? Is it age? Is it racial? What are the live variables?
In some respects, very similar to what you described in Texas, in that the urban areas are overwhelmingly Democratic, rural areas overwhelmingly Republican. The fights tend to be in the areas that are in between, that the parts where people moved out of the city and they're now in some suburban area. Many of them have sort of the same sensibilities as the city folk, while others have the sensibility of the rural folk. And that's where the fights take place. When we talked a little bit earlier about the gerrymandering and the redistricting that's done to help decide how the congressional districts look and how the legislative districts look, Democrats, if they're in control, want to maximize their advantages in the urban areas, minimize their disadvantages in the rural areas. For Republicans who have been drawing the maps now since 2011, it's the reverse. Maximize your advantages in the rural areas, minimize your losses in the urban areas. And the fights tend to be in the parts of the state that are not quite the urban county, but the rings of counties around them, where you have people who will work in the city but might like to live in a county area where there are lower taxes, more land for your home. Those folks can sway either way, depending on the candidates and depending on which are the big issues of the time. But in terms of what you asked for, like the other demographics, what you'd see elsewhere, the African American vote is overwhelmingly Democratic. White vote tends to be for the Republicans. Other minorities, we don't have as large as in Texas, Latino vote, but Latino vote has been one that's been important for Democrats, but has been able to be swayed to Republicans at times. Although I said in North Carolina, unlike in Texas, that's not a huge part of the equation, or hasn't been to date.
Yeah. I was going to say that I don't really think gerrymandering is a thing. I think the word gerrymandering just means this district was drawn in a way I don't like. Because all political districting is, of course, is necessarily political. It's just it's the most political thing a legislature does. Well, I get why people complain about it. Although I noticed that for like 1,000 years, no Democrat ever complained about gerrymandering until like the 1990s, when Republicans got good at it. And the one time in political history where Republicans were actually sort of forward-looking and early adopters about technology, and some relatively sophisticated information-driven approaches to things. They did that with gerrymandering, with redistricting for Republicans, and that was about the time when Democrats started to not like gerrymandering.
Well,
But
and North Carolina has a long history with this. If you look at the various cases that have gone to the Supreme Court over redistricting, North Carolina has been a model for this at least since the 1990s. And we know back in one of the things that Republicans did, they were still in the minority and have been in the minority until they took over the General Assembly after the 2010 election. But one of the things they did in the past that was helpful to them was once it became clear that the courts were going to allow majority minority districts, the Republicans said, oh, yeah, let's have as many of those as we can, because they realized that if there are more majority minority districts, the rest of the districts are going to be much more Republican. Yeah. And they used that to their advantage for a couple of decades until they ended up winning control. And then once they drew the districts, the Democrats started saying, wait a minute, you've got to change the rules now.
Yeah. One way of understanding that, and I just mentioned this because I think it's a helpful way to think about it, and it's maybe a little counterintuitive, which is that if there's a district you're going to lose, that you're going to lose, you don't want to lose it with 51% going to the other candidate. You want to lose it with 99% going to the other candidate.
Right.
Get as many of the other side's votes into that district as possible, and that's how you Pack 'em. I was going to say that the fact that there are two Carolinas is sort of the result of some kind of historical gerrymanderish sort of thinking, but that's another long conversation we don't necessarily need to get into right here. But the other thing I was going to say is that in addition to not sort of accepting that gerrymandering is exactly a thing, I always stop a little bit when people say Latinos, because I want to know who your Latinos are, because people from El Salvador and people from northern Mexico and people from southern Mexico are politically really quite different from one another. So, what does the composition of North Carolina's Latino community look like?
Well, I will plead a bit of ignorance on this because I have not studied it very closely, but I know we do have a decent sized group who are of Mexican descent.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Largely recent immigrants or longstanding communities or a bit of both, or
more recent. There are some longstanding communities, but not many to speak of. It's certainly not like a border state that has been dealing with this since the state began. For North Carolina, the Spanish-speaking community is a much more recent phenomenon, and a lot of it had to do with agriculture.
well, I mean, not counting like the Spanish Empire and stuff that used to be
Right.
sort of a factor in North America, but it's been a while on that front. Okay, so you've got Latino voters, you've got African American voters who are going to lean Democratic typically. You've got white voters leaning Republican. You've got cities leaning Democratic. You've got rural areas leaning Republican. You've got some battles in the suburbs. Are there other particular political fault lines in North Carolina that wouldn't be obvious to people who don't really know the state?
Well, in terms of East versus West, we apparently have that crop up from time to time. That has not been as big an issue, but that used to be an issue when Democrats were largely in control of the state government because Western North Carolina tends to go a little bit more Republican, and for years and years, Eastern North Carolina was more Democratic. There was a lot of consternation about Western North Carolina being looked down upon or not having as much of an influence as Eastern North Carolina. And if I talk to Republicans of a certain age who are from west of, say, Greensboro, they'll complain about those Eastern North Carolina Democrats. The other factor to keep in mind is our largest city is Charlotte,
Mm-hmm.
but because of where Charlotte is located, a lot of people don't even think of Charlotte as part of North Carolina. Charlotte sees itself as of the Carolinas because it's right there on the state line. A
Yeah.
lot of the people who live or who work in Charlotte live across the line in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or vice versa. They'll live in Charlotte and work in Rock Hill. And so some people describe Charlotte as the great state of Mecklenburg because that's the name of its county, and they see them as their own thing. And for years and years, people in Charlotte, the largest city, had a hard time winning a statewide election because people in the other parts of the state just didn't quite trust those folks in the Charlotte area.
It's like people from Dallas running for office in Texas. Nobody really likes them. And Charlotte is, in my view, by the way, one of the nicest cities in the United States. It's just a really, really lovely place. I was curious with the Republican tendencies in Western North Carolina. Are those very old? Is this something that was true in, say, the 40s and 50s when Republicans were really first starting to make inroads into the South? Or is that sort of a post-Reagan phenomenon?
No, this really is something that goes far back. And part of that is even going back to the 19th century, the western part of the state was the part of the state that was most likely to want to be part of the Union,
Mm-hmm.
less likely to want to be part of the Confederacy. And so because of the way the parties shook out after that, the Democrats ended up being the party of having been the former Confederacy, and they were more in the East, while Republicans tended to be in the West. And so you'll see some Western North Carolina Republicans who are not as down the line with the 70s and beyond conservative movement of free markets and limited government. They'll be more like, well, let's just do things better than the Democrats, but have the same sort of policies.
Yeah, well, I wish I could say it was just old-fashioned Republicans in Western North Carolina who are no longer down with free markets
Right.
and small government and all that stuff. That seemed to be a more generalized Republican position these days. But
Seems to be the reason for the dispatch,
Well, we are trying to remind people that somebody should probably believe in things like free markets and free trade and individual rights and the rule of law and those things. Maybe personality cults aren't entirely consistent with the American way and our Republican traditions, small R Republican traditions, I mean, and all the rest of it. But that's another long, sad story. We don't have to necessarily get into right now. So, okay, there are two aspects of the upcoming election that I think are separate and should be talked about separately when it comes to the aftermath of the storm there. And one we've got into a little bit already, which is people's ability to vote. Whether the election is going to be, sort of staged and managed in a way that makes it reasonably accessible to everybody who wants to vote. And my impression, just from driving around a little bit and from talking to people there, is that there are likely to be some real big challenges with that. Just the way there are challenges with anything when you don't have running water and electricity and communication is spotty, and you're having to hand out MREs to people so they don't starve to death and that sort of thing. But then there's also the question of whether we think that the storm and its aftermath are likely to change political attitudes. And the cynical and gross way in which people are trying to recruit the suffering of people in Western North Carolina for political purposes is just stomach turning, in my view. All of this, sort of nonsense, the conspiracy theories you alluded to earlier, this crazy, social media cosplay of people talking about, I'm a Marine sniper and I shot 5 FEMA people yesterday. I don't know if you saw this thing that was making the rounds, like there's some sort of pitched battle going on in North Carolina. But there is a concentrated political movement, generally associated with the Republican Party and the Trump campaign, that wants people in Western North Carolina to feel like they are being punished for being Republicans or for being right of center or being Trump voters or whatever. That the Biden administration, the governor of the state, FEMA, and everyone else is conspiring to make life miserable for them in the hopes that the fear and resentment and outrage that this provokes will inspire people to get to the polls and vote for Donald Trump in very large numbers. And also, I think that it's not only for the people in Western North Carolina, of course, but this is being used for the audience outside there to say, look how corrupt and evil and awful this regime, their favorite word, is. Do you think any of that horsepucky is likely to actually influence the election very much?
I doubt that it will. And one of the reasons is if the idea is to drum up more Trump support in Western North Carolina among those who feel that they are being abused by the system, there's not much more you can drum up there. I mean, it's already very heavily Republican. It's not like you're going to turn a 50-50 area into being 55-45 Trump by doing this. This is an area that's already very Republican, that generally would be supportive of Donald Trump. And so if it has any impact, it would be to tell the people who were already thinking they were going to vote for him that, all right, I'm definitely going to vote for him, even if it's going to be difficult. But that doesn't get him more votes. That just gets him the votes he already needed to get to win. Another thing that's interesting to keep in mind, and this could change between now and Election Day, but another piece of that conversation that I had, actually an email exchange with Professor Cooper at Western Carolina University, was one of the things I asked him was, what do you think is going to be the impact of the politicians and what they're doing in Western North Carolina? Is it going to drive people one way or the other? And he said, well, without trying to be too glib, you would know better than I, meaning I, because we aren't getting the communication here. If we don't have communication, we don't really know what they're doing. So a lot of those folks aren't getting any message because they're still trying to get reliable internet or get their lives back into gear. So they aren't paying much attention to what the politicians are doing. So it does have a potential to impact and influence people one way or another. But I don't think it's a huge advantage for Donald Trump because he's basically speaking to people who outside of Asheville and outside of Watauga County, where Boone and Appalachian State are located, he's talking to his own people. So basically getting those people out to vote rather than converting people who might vote for Kamala Harris and the rest of the Democratic team.
Yeah, not a lot of low-hanging fruit for the Republicans out there in that
No.
in that world, I would think. But I was thinking principally about the use of, North Carolina for audiences outside the state. These conspiracy theories that aren't really designed to get people to vote in North Carolina, but designed to get people to vote in, say, Georgia or Nevada or places like that, where it's a very live contest, and where these sorts of imbecilic, pornographic conspiracy theories and such can unfortunately seem to be politically useful.
Yeah, and that's a possibility that it will have an impact there. I think part of that will depend on just how well the Biden-Harris administration and the Roy Cooper administration here in North Carolina perform. So far, I don't think you can look at anything that they've done and say, oh, this has been a terrible failure. We've heard about FEMA, but FEMA often has kind of a slow reaction to how things play out because you don't, at the immediate impact of a storm, know what has happened. You kind of have to assess, all right, what just happened? What do we have to do about it? We've seen FEMA run into problems with other storms. Katrina comes to mind,
True.
but other places, other times and places, no one exactly knows what a storm is going to do, especially one that's a rare one like this going through Western North Carolina. Now, here in North Carolina, we know hurricanes. If you live on the coast, you're probably going to face a hurricane once every few years. And so people in that part of the state kind of generally have an idea how they work, how the government's going to respond, who you have to go to if you need to get your house fixed. But this is something that doesn't strike Western North Carolina as often and has never struck Western North Carolina the way that Helene did. And so you're in uncharted territory. And I think as time goes on, if it looks as if the Roy Cooper administration, if the Biden-Harris administration and FEMA are kind of getting things ramped up and getting the services to people that you would expect in the aftermath of a storm, that anything that's causing people concern and consternation right now will settle down a bit. Now, if it looks like they continue to bungle things for weeks on end, that could have an impact. And that's certainly something that the Trump campaign would try to exploit, not just here, but in other places. But if the government does what government does, which is sometimes good and sometimes like what we'd expect as a limited government outfit for government operations, then that probably is going to have a limited impact politically.
Yeah. I take it Professor Cooper and Governor Cooper are not related? Pretty
Not
common.
related, as far as I know. No, but both have the same name, and that's not uncommon in North Carolina as well. There's some parts of the state where if you hear a name, you know where that person's from and know that they have many other relatives who are also involved in government there.
I interviewed a police chief one time in Eastern Kentucky who said if you told him the address and time of day a crime happened at, he could narrow down the suspects to like 3 people. And so he actually had literally the usual suspects for his area, but it was a very small area. Now, as you say, of course,
Back in my reporting days, I once did a story in southeastern North Carolina where there were 4 people named Gore, Gore, none of whom were related, but were all involved in the story. The police chief, the victim, the judge, and the DA were all named Gore, all unrelated.
oh goodness, that so you just use full names for every reference? Tom
Oh
Gore,
yeah,
Bob
you
Gore,
had to,
John Gore,
or at least Chief Gore, DA Gore.
right? Hope you had a miss in there or something, so you could have a lady in it, and you could do it that way. Now, as you mentioned, the coastal Carolinas, of course, know all about hurricanes. They're basically Florida on that front. But Asheville is what, 2,200 feet up in the mountains, um, and hundreds of miles from the coast. A little bit of a freak occurrence, I think, in the sense that they'd had really, really heavy rains before Helene came in. So they said that I guess they'd had 2 days in which they'd had 8 inches of rain, which is quite a lot for them, before the actual tropical storm came rolling in. So that is a fairly unusual thing, although I guess they've had floods within recent memory, I mean, within the last 20 years, related from other weather events, although nothing obviously quite like this. I've been to a lot of areas in crisis of various kinds, and Asheville, I was very heartened to see the local response, and and FEMA and the state were there too. There were official actors there as well, but the kind of boots on the ground, churches, businesses, civil associations, people who were obviously just private citizens who had chainsaws and were clearing areas, and Amish guys with farm implements and all that kind of stuff. It was it was heartening to see. At the same time, though, it's bad. It's very, very seriously challenged in terms of its infrastructure and its resources. So, for instance, I guess a year ago in September, I was in Kiev in Ukraine, and a place at war. They had running water and electricity and internet and businesses that were operating and all that sort of thing. Now it's gotten a bit worse since then, since the Russians have stepped up the attacks. But Asheville is right now worse off than a lot of war zones and places that have had natural disasters strike in countries that don't have the sorts of resources and institutions the United States does, just because of the physical realities of what's happened there. And of course, the areas outside of Asheville are generally even more challenged because it's more difficult to get supplies and resources there. So I think that just for listeners to know that it's going to be an enormously difficult thing to build out of and to recover from, and this is going to be, I would guess, probably not very much improved by Election Day. Now they'll have the power back on, and they'll have, I assume, the water running again. Although I live a few hundred miles from there, and my town's still boiling water. We're still under a boil water notice, although we turn on the taps and water comes out. So we've got electricity and all that kind of stuff. So this is not something where it's going to be, oh, remember that thing that happened a few weeks ago. Now we've all gotten over it and let's go vote on Election Day. One of the things about the, I guess, the kind of dramatic character of Donald Trump being in American public life is that there's so much plot that goes with it. It's like an old-fashioned serial, where every 30 minutes there's some cliffhanger and radical new thing that we're just like, yeah, 2 assassination attempts. Oh, that was weird. What's next? It's like we're going to completely forget. Oh yeah, he's been impeached twice. He's been charged with a raft of felonies. All this stuff that's happened, and with Trump, it seems like we just get past it, right? You just go from episode to episode, and 3 episodes down, you forget what happened 4 episodes ago. It's not like a well-written television show like Lost or Breaking Bad or something like that. It's like a badly written sort of amateurish television show where it just lurches from thing to thing. But this is not going to be that. This is something that's going to be very, very much with us through Election Day and afterward. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on just the issue of fatigue. I think that's one of the harder things about situations like this, where a lot of people like me, I can deal with a bad thing happening to me if it doesn't last very long. Like if you gave me a choice between like 3 months of mild irritation versus an hour of intense pain, I would rather have the hour of intense pain, I think, and just have it over with. But that's not really an option here. There's going to be months and months and probably years and years of recovery. And particularly, Asheville having such a tourist dependent economy, where just most of the infrastructure that supported that is damaged or swept away or going to be challenged in ways that are very difficult to recover from. So there will be a life after the election. I think people sometimes forget about that. I wonder if you have views on any of those things.
Yes, this is definitely going to be a long-term recovery, and you alluded to something that's going to be a challenge in the not too distant future, and that is this is about the time when people take to Western North Carolina to see the foliage, to take advantage of all of the tourist options. And then when you get deeper into the year, this is when you go for skiing. And so basically fall into winter is when a lot of people like to go to Western North Carolina. And this year, that's just not going to happen. Even the places that would be able to accommodate people coming in, there are probably going to be a lot of them who will just think, oh, well, Western North Carolina, we're not even going to think about it this year. And so even if you were able to accept a lot of people to come in who would help boost your economy, bring some dollars in from outside the area. They're just not going to be there. And that's going to be a challenge. We know that from the state government perspective, our General Assembly comes back for a session that was already scheduled this week, and they're going to deal with a hurricane relief package. But they described it, as they should, as an initial relief package, because they only know a little bit about what's needed at this point that they could deal with from the state perspective. I'm guessing that there will probably be at least one more hurricane relief package this year. And then the new General Assembly that comes in 2025 will have to deal with hurricane relief. And then they'll have to make sure that the hurricane relief they set up doesn't end up getting bogged down in bureaucracy. Because one of the things this last General Assembly dealt with was a special committee looking into hurricane relief from Eastern North Carolina several years ago that had yet to be finished. And there were people who had been out of their homes in Eastern North Carolina for several years, and it still hadn't been resolved. Western North Carolina, you don't want to see them have to deal with the same thing. But knowing the way government operates, it's something that's going to be a possibility that there will be things set up to help people get back on their feet that just won't roll the way that you expected them to. And so this region's going to be dealing with these issues for a long time. And so the election will mark a dot on the line of that progression, but it's just going to be the first dot. And it would not surprise me to see that the way that the government responds to Helene could be a factor in elections in 2026 if it's done poorly. People out there might say, hey, we elected you to do something about this and we're still struggling a couple of years later. I mean, I'm not going to predict that would happen, but it wouldn't surprise me based on what has happened with past hurricanes and on the amount of damage this region is going to be dealing with.
Yeah. What was the state's fiscal situation like before the storm? Obviously, they're going to have a lot of enormous burdens in terms of outlays that are necessary right now, and those are going to come at a time in which I think we can fairly reasonably expect tax revenue to suffer a serious setback as the tourism economy vanishes, at least for a time, and as other economic activity is depressed and people's incomes go down and business incomes vanish, I would assume, more or less. How is the state prepared to deal with that? Well prepared? Ill prepared?
Well prepared at this point. I mean, no one knows at exactly what the hit's going to be. So there will be a hit. But going into this, we had a rainy day fund of $4.75 billion. Okay. That's going to be helpful. There are other reserves that they can rely on. Our fiscal situation was in such good shape that we have built in to the state budget and the documents that are planned for future tax cuts. So, I mean, if worst came to worst, they could delay the tax cuts if they needed the additional revenue. But at this point, no one is saying anything about that. They're basically saying, look, we have a rainy day fund that we have built up to well over $4 billion. This is the rainy day. This is the time to use it, and then we could build it back up in the future. So I think the focus among the bean counters at this point is, all right, let's spend what we need to spend, and then we'll go back and see what we need to do. It's not a situation where North Carolina has been at times in the past where you're already looking at $1 billion, $2 billion shortfall, and oh no, now we have another storm to deal with. We were in good shape going into this, and so we'll have to just be cautious and careful about how to address this and not set ourselves up for fiscal problems later by either overspending elsewhere or cutting taxes beyond what's going to be something that is going to be fiscally sustainable. And I suspect that'll be a partisan fight too, because the Democrats who have run the governor's mansion and who are likely to run the governor's mansion again after the election, they have said, don't move forward with these tax cuts. And I'm guessing they're definitely going to come back with that message again, saying, look, stop the tax cuts in their track. We're not going to call for you to raise rates at this point, but just don't cut them anymore. Spend what you need to spend. on this hurricane relief, and they'll also say throw more money at the public schools while you're at it. And the Republican General Assembly, it'll be interesting to see where they come down on this. Do they say, okay, yeah, let's pause what we're going to do on taxes because we have this shock to the system, or do they say, no, we can spend the money on the relief and continue down the road of getting our corporate tax rate to zero and lowering our personal income tax rate, which at this point is in the 4% range and is on track to go down about 2.5% in the years ahead. So I'm almost certain, a fight that we see play out in the new General Assembly in 2020.
Yeah, as I always tell people, the thing about unexpected events is they are unexpected. And it's a lot easier to deal with a crisis if you've got money in the bank and resources, which gives you choices and options and the ability to do things both quickly and in the long term. And that's one of the things that always terrifies me about the national fiscal situation, which is that if we have some sort of crisis, whether it's a fiscal crisis or military crisis or something else, or who knows, a natural disaster that ends up being a nationwide crisis of some kind, when you're running the sort of deficits we have, when you have as much outstanding debt as we do, when so much of our revenue is now dedicated just to debt service and, paying down the interest on money we've already spent decades ago now at this point, we don't have nearly as many options as we would if we had a much more sustainable and responsible and rational fiscal policy. This is
wouldn't it be nice if some politicians were talking about this?
Yeah, it would be nice if politicians were talking about this. It seems like the sort of thing you would look at and go, perhaps therein lies a lesson for the rest of the country and certainly other states as well. We've seen some states, Texas has been a good example of this, that have been pretty reasonable about stocking up their rainy day funds. Although the part of Texas I grew up in is a desert, we haven't had any rainy days in the last 5 years fund, which is more of a problem for us than rainy days. Your rainy day fund is a little on the nose, I think, for what's been going on out there. But of course, then you got a lot of poorly managed states that have the opposite situation where they've got, they're overcommitted, under-resourced, and unable to make nimble changes and make long-term investments and do intelligent things. As we get toward the bottom of the podcast here, though, I'd like to give you a chance to tell us a little more about the John Locke Foundation, what you do, various needs for reform in a broader way in North Carolina, about things they should be doing differently, things they do well compared to other states. This is your moment to tell me all about your remit and to do a little public relations for yourself in the process if necessary.
Well, thanks so much. The John Locke Foundation is a free market public policy think tank based here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we focus primarily on state government issues in North Carolina. For folks who aren't familiar with the Locke Foundation or groups like ours, there is a free market public policy think tank focusing on state government in every one of the states. I'm sure you've had dealings with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is one of the biggies of our group. We're one of the older ones, started around 1990, and have been dealing with the issues at the North Carolina level for a number of years. For probably the first 20 years that we were in existence, much of what we did was complain, because we would talk about bad things that were being done by state government, and the Democrats who ran our state government said, well, thank you, but we're going to ignore you. And then Republicans won in 2010, which was a big election for Republicans across the country, took control of our General Assembly. And we discovered at that point, oh, hey, there's people who might listen to some of the things that we have to say. And so after that took place, we saw tax reform start to take place based on our recommendations, where we had a tiered income tax that was one of the highest in the Southeast. Now it's a flat rate tax. It is, as I mentioned earlier, has been going down, is scheduled to continue to go down. I know that the Republican leaders of our General Assembly would like to continue to see it go down. We'll see if Helene and its damage causes any slowdown in that movement. They've been moving corporate tax rate to zero, which is something that we recommended since it's basically a tax on anything other than getting back at those big corporate baddies. We have been advocating for school choice, have been some of the people pushing North Carolina to get rid of an old cap that it had in public charter schools, to open up school vouchers through an opportunity scholarship program, education savings accounts. We've pushed for various sorts of regulatory reform, some of which has caught the ear of lawmakers and that they have been good about dealing with. Other times they say, well, hey, let's have this new occupational licensing board. And we have to go, no, come on. That's against what you would want to do if you want to actually improve the economy. But that's the main role that we play, and we play this role as an advocate for free markets and limited government in various ways. One is the traditional think tank, pump out the white papers way, where you put out a report, you give it to some lawmakers. Most of them just say thank you and put it in the circular file, but some who are interested might read it, and eventually it'll become legislation. We also have a publication called Carolina Journal that covers state government and policy areas, and has emerged really in recent years as one of the most important pieces of journalism in terms of covering what's going on in state government as the rest of the journalism community has declined. And then we also have outreach efforts where we will meet with various groups across the state that are interested in knowing what's going on in Raleigh and what they can do and what they should do to keep their legislators honest and try to keep them at the task at hand, and not just getting involved in cronyism, which is a problem whoever is in charge. We saw it for a number of years with the Democrats being in charge, doing the backroom deals, give a guy a bag of cash in the IHOP bathroom and tell him, don't tell anyone we did this. In more recent years, we've seen some signs that some members of the Republican leadership would like to get involved in that type of thing, because the guys who want the government to do bad things, they're going to go to the people in power, whoever they are, Democrat or Republican. So that's one of the ways that we keep an eye on things that are going on. And the mission is to help North Carolina be the freest and most prosperous state it can be. And our goal is to do that through free markets, limited government, rule of law, following the Constitution, making sure that our courts are full of people who would rather follow the law as it's written, follow the Constitution, rather than make up the law as judges. So that's what the John Locke Foundation is about. That was the spirit in which we moved forward with doing the article for the Dispatch, was in our effort to kind of shine a light on things going on in North Carolina and help to spread that word in other parts of the country as well.
Surely it was a Waffle House bathroom.
You would think, but actually that deal that I'm talking about took place in an IHOP bathroom.
I am shocked and appalled by this sellout to corporate homogeneity. Every state has something weird about it politically. Like, Kansas is super Republican, but not super conservative. Texas is full of people who take the notion of independence seriously, where there's this whole mythology about it that results in people believing things that aren't true, like that Texas has the legal right to secede and various other things like that. Just an old myth. It's never been case. What's weird about North Carolina?
I think one of the strangest things about North Carolina is we're in the South, but there are a lot of people who don't really think of us as South. I mean, we're not Alabama, we're not Mississippi, we're not Florida, which is, as you know, more south the more north you go.
Right, yeah.
But North Carolina traditionally has been in the South, but not necessarily of the South, in the sense that Democrats for years and years, even after Republicans took over much of the rest of the South, Democrats could still win in North Carolina. Now they stopped winning in the presidential race, as I mentioned. Carter won in '76, Obama won in 2008, but otherwise all of the elections in there have gone to Republicans. But at the state level, people have been willing to vote for Democrats to be in charge of major offices. And in fact, one of the things that has been a major factor over the last two election cycles are Cooper Trump voters, people who want Donald Trump as president, but want Roy Cooper, a Democrat, to be the governor. And that has been something that I think we'll continue to see in North Carolina. The Democrats have been talking for years and years about, the demographics are going in our favor. We're becoming a much more Democratic state. Election after election, though, it has tended to be Republicans, unless it's a really bad year for Republicans, tended to have a slight advantage in these elections. But there is a very entrenched nature of people looking at North Carolina as not quite like the rest of the South. I think Virginia has become a lot more like that in recent cycles, as well as Nova or Norva, or however you describe it, has become much more blue. That they've seen a similar situation to what North Carolina had been dealing with for a long time, and that is, we're Southern, but we don't like to be considered as Southern as some of these other states. I mean, I think the biggest quirk that we have right now is that our election up and down the ballot, with the possible exception of Trump, might be impacted by the fact that we have an African American running for governor, but he's a Republican and he's controversial, and he's made all kinds of statements that have really hurt him in the polls, and that may be bringing other Republicans up and down the ballot down as we get closer and closer to election day. He's trailing by double digits in the polls, and we elect 10 statewide executive branch leaders, and polls earlier in the spring, summer had Republicans leading almost all of them. Now, Democrats probably leading in half or more of them. And I think you have to trace a lot of that to people's attitudes about Mark Robinson as the gubernatorial candidate, and the fact that as they vote against him on that ballot line, or are thinking of it, they're thinking about the same thing going down the ballot, which could also have impacts if they continue to do that on our state Supreme Court, which is elected in partisan elections, and also for the legislature. I don't think there's any chance, because of the way the districts are drawn, that Republicans lose the General Assembly, but it would be very easy to see them losing veto-proof supermajorities. And so if you have a Democratic governor, a Republican-led General Assembly, but without veto-proof supermajorities, we could see what we saw a few years ago, and that is a couple of years of stalemate where no budget gets passed, no legislation that could be conceivably conceived as Republican gets passed, and the General Assembly just kind of treads water for a while.
Yeah.
Which would be bad news if they have to deal with any sort of hurricane relief package, if it has any kind of controversy.
Yeah. Robinson is not a great candidate.
Not in any respect. And the problem is, for a number of these Republican candidates, he was incredibly popular among the Republican base. And so a lot of these candidates who are running for other offices that no one had ever heard of, they latched on to Mark Robinson. They'd take photos with him. They were the Mark Robinson candidate. We had one guy who had buttons made up of Robinson and him, and now they're trying to walk away from that, and it's not working so far.
You know, it's funny. We're in a moment of very strange, right-wing populism, which we've had, I guess, going on for a few years. And the sort of more intellectual among them have identified as the great supervillain of political history, John Locke, of all people. How is it being at the John Locke Foundation at a time when John Locke is maybe in lower repute among conservatives than he has been since, I don't know, the early 19th century?
Well, the nice thing about it is that few of the people that we deal with are dealing with that, the highfalutin, what was John Locke's impact. Just as a brief aside, I should have mentioned this when I gave you the spiel, but the reason that we are the John Locke Foundation is that Locke not only was an influence on the founders, writing about life, liberty, and property, but he also, because of his role working with the Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Cooper, helped write the original Constitution of the Carolinas.
Hmm.
So that was one of the reasons why the folks who founded our group decided to make this the John Locke Foundation. But yeah, it's
Another
interesting.
Cooper in the mix.
Yes, another Cooper, Anthony Ashley Cooper, I believe was his name. And so we haven't had to deal with as much of the impact of Locke being in less high regard than he used to be. But we do, because we've been around for so long and because we are willing to work with people in the General Assembly and in other parts of government who are willing to work with us. Those who are the populists and who are the flamethrowers will see us as part of the problem. We're part of the establishment. And we think, wait a minute, none of us works for government. We don't take a dime of government money. And we criticize them probably more than we will work with them, yet we're part of the problem. So,
Yes.
yeah, there.
Don't you love it when people who are in the state legislature call you the establishment? It's always seems silly. I'll bore everyone with the story, which I've told a million times, but maybe there's some listeners who haven't heard it because this is Jonah's podcast. But years ago, before Trump and all that stuff, before this stuff really, even before the Tea Party movement, before this stuff really started to spring up, I was at a dinner, and one of the guys there was at the time the chairman of the State Republican Party of California. And he started doing this thing about how he's anti-establishment, and he's Mr. Anti-Establishment. And the establishment hates me. Dude, you're the chairman of the party. I mean, if there's such a thing as the establishment, it's you, right? I mean, it's literally you. But people love to talk that way. People just love to talk that way. It makes them feel cool, makes them feel rebellious, makes them feel like they're doing something more interesting than trying to, at the margins, reform things in state government to make things in a basically good and functional country a little bit better and a little bit more functional, which is what we're all really trying to do here.
Yeah. And since this is Jonah's podcast generally, one of the things I've loved hearing him say in the past that I've trotted out every once in a while was, we all know the term RINO, and the fact that RINO is trotted out to talk about moderate Republicans who are not on the conservative bandwagon. And if I remember correctly, the way he said it is, don't you want to be, if you're conservative, don't you want to be the RINO? You're actually conservative, and you're only Republican because the Republicans are the ones who are more likely to go along with you. The Republicans are the ones who just want to win and will take any position possible and have no principles and are all about just getting in office. Wouldn't it be better to be, if you are conservative and you're worried about these folks who are just going to shift one way or the other, wouldn't you want to be the RINO? You're a conservative and you're only a Republican because you think that Republicans are going to be more likely to go along with these conservative ideas.
Yeah, I get the RINO thing a lot myself, and I always have to remind people I'm not even a Republican in name, much less a Republican in name only. Okay, one last thing I have to ask you about. I'm a fan of Cocaine Mitch, and you are Mitch Kokai. What is the origin of your surname?
It is Hungarian. And people are often surprised. They will think some sort of Asian name, and
it looks Hawaiian.
Hawaiian, Polynesian, and Kokai is actually a word in Japanese, and I think it means multiple things. I at one point heard it was some sort of patent, but then if you Google Kokai, there was some sort of tech company that decided to call itself Kokai because it means something kind of cool in Japanese as well, like much more cool than patent. But my name is Hungarian. The Kokais that I'm associated with came over from Hungary just before World War I, so their timing was good.
I knew there'd be an Orban connection here someday if we went too far.
Well, I can tell you one interesting thing. When I was in college, I studied for a semester at the London School of Economics, and one of the professors I had was a Hungarian. And years later, this was the guy who was in the European Parliament who suggested that they could keep Muslims out of Europe by putting pig heads on stakes at the border and staking them out. And when I saw the guy's name, I'm like, surely this isn't the same guy who was my professor at the London School of Economics. And I looked him up like, yeah, that was him.
the excellent, excellent work we've come to expect from the members of the European Parliament. Wonderful stuff. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with the John Locke Foundation. Best wishes to you all. I enjoyed the conversation very much. And of course, our best wishes and prayers are with the people of North Carolina as they try to rebuild their lives and their communities. And Godspeed.
Kevin, thanks for having me.
My pleasure.